There are approximately 200,000 islands across the oceans of this planet. You can visit nearly all of them. But a handful, a very specific, very dangerous handful, have been permanently sealed off by science, governments, and military institutions. These are not islands closed for renovation. These are islands where crossing the perimeter means exposing your body to biological, chemical, or radiological forces that modern science cannot reverse. The researchers who study these locations do not arrive in tourist boats. They arrive in hazmat suits, carrying dosimeters, antivenom, and sealed containment equipment. Some were weaponized during the Cold War and never decontaminated. Some sit above geological forces that produce gases capable of killing a human being in minutes. One is so densely populated by venomous snakes that the Brazilian Navy patrols its waters with orders to turn every vessel away. And the last island on this list was not sealed to protect us from the island. It was sealed to protect the island from us. Today we explore 10 islands that science has permanently sealed off from humanity. From an island in New York Harbor, where America's most dangerous disease carrier was imprisoned, to a remote atoll, still radiating from the most powerful nuclear weapon the United States ever detonated, these islands were not abandoned. They were condemned. 26 miles off the coast of Sao Paulo, Brazil, there is an island that the Brazilian government has declared permanently off limits to every civilian on Earth. The reason is not political. It is not military. It is biological. Ilha da Queimada Grande, known internationally as Snake Island, is home to an estimated 4,000 golden lancehead pit vipers, one of the most venomous snake species ever documented by science. The golden lancehead's venom is between 3 and 5 times more potent than that of any mainland snake in the Americas. A single bite initiates a hemotoxic cascade that can cause kidney failure, brain hemorrhaging, and the complete dissolution of muscle tissue around the wound within 2 hours. Herpetologist Marcelo Duarte, who has conducted extensive research on the island, estimates the snake density at approximately 1 serpent per square meter in certain forested sections. The vipers evolved in isolation after rising sea levels cut the island off from the mainland roughly 11,000 years ago. Without ground-level predators, the population exploded. Without ground-level prey, the snakes adapted to hunt birds, developing a venom so fast-acting it kills before the bird has time to fly away. The last permanent human residents were a lighthouse keeper and his family. According to local accounts documented by the Brazilian Navy, they were found dead in the lighthouse in the early 1920s, having been bitten multiple times after snakes entered through the windows. If you stepped onto Queimada Grande today, bypassing the Navy patrols, ignoring the federal prohibition, researchers estimate you would be bitten within 5 minutes. The nearest antivenom facility is a 90-minute helicopter ride across open ocean. The island does not forgive trespassers. But Snake Island is dangerous because of what lives there. The next island is dangerous because of what died there, and what that death left behind in the soil, the walls, and the memory of an entire city. Less than 1,000 feet from the neighborhoods of the South Bronx, in the middle of New York City's East River, sits an island that most New Yorkers have never been allowed to visit. North Brother Island has been closed to the public since 1963, and the city government has no plans to ever reopen it. The island's most infamous resident arrived in 1907. Her name was Mary Mallon, known to history as Typhoid Mary. Mallon was the first person in the United States identified as an asymptomatic carrier of Salmonella typhi. She appeared perfectly healthy while shedding a bacterium that killed approximately 10% of those infected. George Soper, the sanitary engineer who tracked her down, documented that Mallon had directly infected at least 51 people across 7 households, 3 of whom died. The New York City Health Department forcibly quarantined Mallon on North Brother Island. She lived there in isolation for 23 years, until her death in 1938. But Mallon was not the island's only catastrophe. In 1904, the steamship General Slocum caught fire in the East River directly adjacent to the island. Over 1,000 passengers burned to death or drowned, the deadliest disaster in New York City history until September 11, 2001. After Mallon's death, the island served as a facility for heroin addicts, before being permanently shuttered. Today, the crumbling buildings are being consumed by forest. If you set foot on the island now, the danger is no longer biological. It is structural. Floors that collapse without warning, ceilings weakened by 60 years of freeze-thaw cycles, and stairwells that lead to nothing but open air. The island that imprisoned America's most dangerous disease carrier now imprisons only its own crumbling past. But across the Atlantic, one island's history involves something far more deliberately lethal. Anthrax, weaponized by the British military and tested on living creatures. 1 mile off the northwest coast of Scotland lies a small, uninhabited island that was once one of the most biologically contaminated places on the surface of the Earth. Gruinard Island was the primary testing ground for Britain's biological weapons program during the Second World War. In 1942, a team led by microbiologist Paul Fildes transported 80 sheep to the island and detonated bombs filled with anthrax spores. Within days, every sheep was dead. The scientists documented the results, packed their equipment, and left. The anthrax stayed. For the next 48 years, Gruinard Island remained under strict quarantine. Warning signs lined the nearest mainland shore. Boats were prohibited from landing. The specific strain used was Volum 14578, a weaponized variant selected by the Ministry of Defense for its environmental persistence and lethality. Inhaled anthrax from this strain carries a mortality rate exceeding 95% without immediate treatment. The spores do not degrade in sunlight. They do not wash away in rain. They wait. In 1986, the British government initiated a decontamination effort, saturating the island with 280 tons of formaldehyde diluted in seawater. In 1990, a junior defense minister visited the island with a flock of sheep and posed for photographs to declare it safe. But here is what that declaration did not address. The formaldehyde treatment targeted the top layer of soil only. Anthrax spores buried deeper were never comprehensively tested. If you walked across Gruinard today and disturbed the lower soil layers, digging a hole, pulling up a rock, the scientific reality is terrifying enough without the conspiracies. What the British military buried on that island may still be waiting exactly where they left it. A government weaponized a disease, tested it on an island, and spent nearly half a century pretending the problem would solve itself. The next island's contamination came not from beneath the soil, but from the sky, in the form of the most powerful nuclear weapon the United States ever detonated. 2,400 miles southwest of Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, lies a ring of 23 small islands surrounding a turquoise lagoon so pristine it was once featured on postcards. Bikini Atoll has been uninhabitable since 1946, when the United States military chose it as the primary testing ground for its nuclear weapons program. Between 1946 and 1958, the U.S. detonated 23 nuclear devices at Bikini. The most devastating was Castle Bravo in 1954, a hydrogen bomb that yielded 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times the force of the weapon, dropped on Hiroshima. The detonation vaporized 3 entire islands. They no longer exist on any map. The 167 residents of Bikini had been relocated before the tests began. Commodore Ben Wyatt told them the move was temporary and for the good of mankind. They have never returned. 78 years later, the radiation levels in the soil and groundwater remain too high for permanent human habitation. Cesium-137, a radioactive isotope produced by nuclear fission, has a half-life of 30.2 years. Scientists estimate that Bikini Atoll will not be safe for continuous human habitation for at least another 24,000 years. If you stood on the beach at Bikini today, you would not feel the radiation. Your skin would not burn. But the cesium in the coconut crabs has been measured at 10 times the accepted safety limit, and the fruit growing on the island would deliver a cumulative internal dose that, over months, would significantly increase your risk of thyroid cancer and leukemia. A Columbia University study published in 2014 found that radiation levels on certain Bikini Islands still exceeded the safety threshold for the Chernobyl exclusion zone. The lagoon is still beautiful. The islands remain empty. Bikini Atoll was destroyed by what fell from above. The next island carries its horror beneath the surface, and the soil itself, where over 100,000 human beings were reduced to ash. Between the city of Venice and the Lido Barrier Island sits a small, overgrown piece of land that the Italian government has closed to all visitors since 1968. Poveglia Island has earned a reputation as one of the most haunted places in Europe. The scientific reality is far more disturbing than any ghost story. During the bubonic plague outbreaks that devastated Venice between the 14th and 17th centuries, Poveglia served as a lazaretto, a quarantine station for the sick and the dying. Historical records maintained by the Venetian Republic indicate that over 160,000 plague victims were transported to the island. The vast majority died there. Their bodies were burned in massive open-air pyres that consumed the dead continuously for decades. Soil analysis conducted on Poveglia has revealed something extraordinary. Nearly 50% of the topsoil is composed of human ash. The calcium and phosphorus content is consistent with the chemical signature of cremated human remains. You are not walking on Earth. You are walking on the compressed remains of over 100,000 people. In 1922, the Italian government converted the island into a psychiatric hospital. According to accounts preserved by Italian medical historian Giancarlo Ferraro, the facility's chief physician conducted unauthorized experimental procedures on patients, including crude lobotomies. The hospital closed in 1968. The island has been sealed ever since. The Italian government has repeatedly rejected proposals to develop Poveglia for tourism. The official reason involves structural instability. The unofficial reality is simpler. No developer wants to build on a foundation of human cremation ash, and no scientist has definitively ruled out whether pathogens from the original plague burials, buried deeper than the ash layer, could still pose a biological risk. Poveglia's danger is ancient and buried. The next island's danger is invisible, constant, and measured in parts per million, a gas that seeps from the earth and can kill you before you smell it. 112 miles south of Tokyo lies an island where every resident is required by Japanese law to carry a gas mask at all times. Miyakejima sits directly above one of the most active volcanic vents in the Japanese archipelago, and what that volcano exhales is slowly making the island unlivable. In the year 2000, Mount Oyama erupted with catastrophic force, sending ash plumes over 9 miles into the atmosphere. But the eruption was not the most dangerous event. What followed was far worse. The volcano's collapsed crater began emitting massive quantities of sulfur dioxide, a colorless gas that, at concentrations above 100 parts per million, causes severe chemical burns to the lungs. At 500 parts per million, it is fatal within minutes. At its peak, Mount Oyama was releasing between 20,000 and 50,000 tons of sulfur dioxide per day. Volcanologist Kazuhiro Ishihara, who led the monitoring team, recommended immediate total evacuation. The entire population of approximately 3,800 residents was evacuated in September 2000. They were not permitted to return for 4.5 years. When residents returned in 2005, they returned to a fundamentally changed island. Gas alarms are installed across every village. Sirens sound without warning when sulfur dioxide levels spike. If you were caught in a high concentration zone without your gas mask, and the wind shifted in the wrong direction, the sulfur dioxide would enter your airways and begin destroying the tissue lining of your lungs within seconds. You would not have time to run. As of today, the volcanic emissions have not stopped. Restricted zones remain permanently off limits. The residents of Miyakejima live in a perpetual state of chemical alert, sleeping with gas masks beside their beds, listening for sirens that could sound at any moment. The gas on Miyakejima comes from deep inside the earth. The next island's poison was placed there deliberately, by Soviet scientists working on the deadliest biological weapons program in human history. In the middle of what was once the Aral Sea, Now a toxic desert split between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, sits the remains of an island that housed the Soviet Union's most secret and most dangerous laboratory. Vozrojdeniya Island was the primary open-air testing ground for the Biopreparat program, the largest biological weapons initiative in human history. From the 1950s through the early 1990s, Soviet scientists under the direction of Colonel Kanatjan Alibekov, who later defected to the United States and changed his name to Ken Alibek, tested weaponized strains of anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, and brucellosis on the island. Test animals were staked in open fields while aircraft sprayed aerosolized pathogens above them. The kill rates were meticulously recorded. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the laboratory was hastily abandoned. In 1988, Soviet military commanders had ordered the emergency burial of hundreds of tons of anthrax spores in shallow pits on the island. The spores were mixed with bleach, a decontamination method that scientists later confirmed was wholly inadequate. In 2002, a joint U.S.-Uzbek team led by American defense officials traveled to the island and found live anthrax spores in 10 of 11 burial sites tested. The spores were still viable after 14 years underground. The situation has since become significantly worse. As the Aral Sea dried up, one of the worst environmental disasters of the 20th century, Vozrojdeniya ceased to be an island entirely. It became a peninsula connected to the mainland. Animals can now walk directly from the contaminated zones into populated areas. Scientists have documented rodents carrying plague-infected fleas moving between the former island and nearby settlements. If you drove across the dried seabed and walked onto Vozrojdeniya today, you would be standing on one of the most dangerous collections of biological agents ever assembled by human beings, and no one is guarding it. Soviet biological weapons poisoned Vozrojdeniya from within. The next island was consumed not by weapons, but by industry, and then abandoned to crumble into the sea. 9 miles off the coast of Nagasaki, a concrete fortress rises from the East China Sea. Hashima Island, known as Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island, for its distinctive silhouette, was once the most densely populated place on Earth. At its peak in 1959, 5,259 people lived on a rocky outcrop, barely 6 hectares in size. Today, most of the island is permanently off-limits, and what remains standing could collapse at any moment. The island's history begins in 1890, when the Mitsubishi Corporation purchased Hashima and began mining the rich undersea coal deposits beneath it. Over the following decades, Mitsubishi built an extraordinary vertical city: apartment buildings, schools, a hospital, a cinema, all compressed onto a platform surrounded by concrete seawalls. But Hashima carries a dark chapter that Japan did not officially acknowledge until 2015. During the Second World War, between 500 and 800 Korean and Chinese forced laborers were brought to the island to work in the mines. Korean historian Soo Jung-woo, who spent years tracing the forced labor program, documented conditions described as brutal. Workers descended over 600 meters underground into tunnels where temperatures exceeded 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Dozens are believed to have died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and mine collapses in total darkness. When petroleum replaced coal, Mitsubishi closed the mines in 1974. The population departed within months. The island has been uninhabited for over 50 years. If you stepped beyond the small designated viewing platform today, you would enter a maze of structures in terminal decay. Typhoons have torn walls open. Salt erosion has weakened reinforced concrete to the point where floors give way without warning. Structural engineers have determined that multiple buildings could collapse catastrophically at any time. UNESCO granted Hashima World Heritage status in 2015, but the science is clear. The island is consuming itself. Hashima was destroyed by abandonment and time. The next island, less than 30 miles from San Francisco, was poisoned by something the United States government dumped into the ocean and hoped the world would forget. 27 miles west of the Golden Gate Bridge, a cluster of jagged granite islands rises from the Pacific Ocean. The Farallon Islands are a national wildlife refuge, home to the largest seabird colony in the contiguous United States. They are also sitting on top of approximately 47,500 barrels of radioactive waste. Between 1946 and 1970, the United States military and the Atomic Energy Commission used the waters surrounding the Farallones as a nuclear dumping ground. 55-gallon drums filled with low-level radioactive material, contaminated equipment, clothing, and laboratory waste from nuclear weapons research were loaded onto barges and dropped into the ocean. Navy records obtained by investigative journalist Jacob Darwin Hamblin through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal that when drums failed to sink, crew members shot them with rifles to puncture the steel and force them underwater. The total quantity of radioactive material dumped near the Farallones has never been precisely determined. Estimates range from 14,000 to 47,500 individual containers, spread across a 540 square mile area of ocean floor at depths up to 6,000 feet. The specific isotopes include cesium-137, plutonium-239, and strontium-90, each with decay timelines measured in decades to millennia. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency stated in a 1991 assessment that the containers are likely corroding and releasing their contents into the surrounding marine environment. However, no comprehensive cleanup has ever been attempted. The EPA concluded that the cost and technical complexity of retrieving the barrels made remediation effectively impossible. Access to the Farallon Islands is restricted by federal law. The great white sharks that patrol these waters and the seabirds nesting on the cliffs above are accumulating isotopes in their tissue that no one is systematically measuring. Beneath the surface, the 47,000 barrels remain exactly where they were dropped, slowly corroding in the cold Pacific darkness. One island remains on our list, and its story is unlike any other, because it was not sealed off to protect us from the island. It was sealed off to protect the island from us. On the 14th of November, 1963, a volcanic eruption beneath the Atlantic Ocean south of Iceland created something that scientists had never witnessed in real time: the birth of a brand new island. Over the next 3.5 years, continuous volcanic activity built Surtsey Island from the ocean floor to a peak elevation of 507 feet above sea level, approximately 20 miles south of Iceland's Vestmannaeyjar archipelago. The scientific significance of Surtsey cannot be overstated. For the first time in recorded history, researchers had the opportunity to observe primary ecological succession, the process by which life colonizes a completely sterile landmass. From the very beginning, the island emerged with no soil, no seeds, no bacteria, no life of any kind. It was a blank biological slate. Botanist Sturla Fridriksson led the first scientific expedition to Surtsey and documented the earliest arrivals: bacteria carried by ocean currents, followed by mosses, then seabirds that brought seeds in their digestive systems. By 2004, 89 plant species had been recorded. Seals had established breeding colonies. Earthworms had appeared in the developing soil. Every single step of this process has been meticulously documented. A once-in-civilization dataset. Iceland's government imposed the strictest access restrictions of any island on Earth. Only a handful of approved researchers are permitted to visit each year. They must sterilize their boots and equipment before stepping ashore. They are prohibited from bringing any biological material: no food, no seeds, no soil. Even urinating on the island is forbidden, as human waste contains bacteria that could contaminate the natural succession process. In 1965, a tomato plant appeared on Surtsey. Scientists traced its origin to a researcher who had defecated on the island during a survey. The plant was immediately destroyed. Surtsey was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008. It remains one of the most pristine natural laboratories on Earth, sealed off not because it is dangerous to humanity, but because humanity is dangerous to it. From the venom-saturated forests of Snake Island to the sterile volcanic rock of Surtsey, From the plague ash of Poveglia to the nuclear craters of Bikini Atoll, from a crumbling quarantine station in the shadow of the Bronx to 47,000 barrels of radioactive waste corroding beneath the Pacific within sight of San Francisco. We have traveled to 10 islands that science, governments, and military institutions have permanently removed from the human map. Each island tells a different story. Some were poisoned by nature, snakes that evolved without predators, volcanoes that exhaled toxic gas without pause or warning. Others were poisoned by human decisions, anthrax bombs detonated in the name of national defense, nuclear weapons tested in the name of deterrence, radioactive waste dumped into the ocean in the name of convenience. And one, just one, was sealed off not because it threatens us, but because we threaten it. Cersei reminds us that the instinct to protect does not always mean protecting ourselves. Sometimes it means protecting a place from the single most invasive species on this planet. The scientists who study these islands are not keeping secrets. They are keeping vigil. They monitor radiation levels that will not reach safety for 20,000 years. They test soil for anthrax spores that could remain viable for a century. They enforce exclusion zones around snakes that could kill you before a helicopter arrives. The warning signs are not challenges to be overcome. They are the final line between curiosity and catastrophe. Some islands were never meant for human footprints, and the wisest thing we can do is respect the science, honor the boundaries, and leave these forbidden islands exactly as they are. Which of these 10 forbidden islands disturbed you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if this journey kept you watching, consider subscribing. There is much more to explore.